Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you. Hi, Todd. Okay. Marjorie's my notary.
Okay.
Reagan is going to be one of the witnesses. Kate will be the other witness.
I decided to sign a prenup against my lawyer's advice. In the end, I know all this legal stuff is not going to keep me from being with Kandi. You do many of these on the day of the wedding?
I have done a couple.
Yeah.
All right, I'm rolling. Okay.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, ready. Okay. This is a video recording of the execution of the prenuptial agreement between Kandi Burruss and Todd Tucker. You acknowledge that you've had a sufficient amount of time and opportunity to fully consider the prenuptial agreement and to request changes to the prenuptial agreement.
Yes.
You understand that you are giving up your rights to periodic alimony, lump sum alimony, alimony in kind, attorney's fees and expenses of litigation, property settlement, equitable distribution, and community property.
Tonight's story doesn't begin with a rumor. It begins with a signature, a legal voice, a notary, witnesses in a room where love was reduced to clauses and forever was measured in fine print. No music, no romance, just the sound of a future being boxed into a contract and sealed. For years, the world believed a fairy tale. Power couple, business empire, public smiles, private strength. But the document you just heard isn't a love story. It's a blueprint for survival. Because when a marriage reaches the point where vows turn into legal language, it means the real war has already started quietly. What you're about to hear next is not emotional. It's tactical. Not a breakup. A takeover. And when children become leverage and contracts become weapons, there are no winners. Only damage. Tonight, we are not telling you who to believe. We're showing you what was signed, what was demanded, and what changed when the cameras stopped. This is not entertainment. It's evidence. And once you hear it, the story you thought you knew will never sound the same again.
I have a question for people who have had prenups or who are part of the prenup land or who have signed a prenup. How easy is it to get out of it? Because the way Todd is running this shit is crazy, bruh. This man said, I want to break that damn prenup when he sat there on live TV and said, I'm going to sign this prenup because ain't nothing going to stop me. Ain't nothing going to stop our love. We're going to be together forever. You signed that shit. And Kandi, you was right. You was smart. But now he wants
The room did not feel like a place where a marriage had once been celebrated. It felt like the aftermath of something that had already ended, long before paperwork made it official. When the public first heard this case, they were told it was a calm separation. No mudslinging, no screaming, no custody war, no courtroom circus. Just two adults moving on respectfully. That illusion did not survive the filing. Because buried inside quiet legal language was a demand that nobody expected. Full custody, spousal support, child support, and a direct attempt to destroy the single document that should have prevented any of it. A prenuptial agreement. But the story does not begin in court. It begins with something much smaller, much uglier, and far more revealing.
I used to date somebody back in the day, that motherfucker catered like I was a billionaire. But it was just something that they enjoyed doing
How did she
for me.
cater that she was a billionaire if she didn't have
No,
no...
I said she catered like I was a billionaire. So I walked in, and she would work. She worked like anybody else. She had a child, but she would cook. She would cook in her panties. She would do all kind of shit.
Okay, so why y'all didn't stay together?
Yeah, right. She's so damn capable.
Yeah.
That footage wasn't recorded in anger. It wasn't recorded during a breakdown. It wasn't captured in the heat of a fight. It was casual, which is what made it dangerous. Because when someone tells you who they are when they aren't angry, that's the version you're supposed to believe. This wasn't a man reminiscing over love. This was a man discussing service. Not emotion. Not partnership. Not loyalty. Service. A woman was not described as a soul. She was described as a benefit. As proof of what a man deserves when he believes he has reached a certain level. And once you heard that clip, it became impossible to ignore one question. Was the marriage ever about love? Or had it always been about comfort? Time passed. The empire grew. The cameras rolled. And the audience kept clapping. But behind closed doors, something else was fermenting. Years into the relationship, something changed. The tone of the conversations. The energy around money. The language around ownership. And it showed in the cracks Todd never realized he left behind on camera.
Everything else we've done together.
Right. Which I thought we was always doing so together, and then you tried to cut me out.
I create a lot of things that I don't care that I don't get credit for.
Okay.
Anything I create, Kandi, da-da-da-da.
So you
want...
I do not really some weird words.
But that's the way it
When people fall out of love, you hear heartbreak. When business partners fall out, you hear inventory. This didn't sound like a man emotionally abandoned. This sounded like a man financially injured. not grief. Calculation. Not a failed marriage. A failed investment. And slowly, quietly, something else became clear to people watching closely. He wasn't speaking like a husband. He was speaking like a shareholder. Then came the clip that, in hindsight, should have changed everything. Because it wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't metaphorical. It was rehearsrsed.
Break up, and now I got to take care of that anyway.
Right, and that's why
So,
to me,
does that make
I would
sense?
think it would make more sense to say, "Hey, if we ever break up, we would
Sell the house.
we would sell this house,
Put you in
and you would
something
stay in something
you could afford.
not put you in the hood and that, especially if we got kids together.
Right.
But maybe it wouldn't be this house.
Well, it could have been a scheme that Todd set up for him to come.
That wasn't comfort. That was contingency. That wasn't reassurance. That was an exit plan. This was not a man in love talking about whatever happens. This was a man already narrating Plan B out loud. Before anything had officially fallen apart. Before the divorce was public. Before lawyers touched paper. It sounded less like a husband calming his fear. And more like a man mentally reorganizing his future. Without her. Then came the fight no one was supposed to remember. But cameras don't forget.
Worried about Kandi being fair. I feel like he wants to pound his chest a little bit because he's read the jokes.
Damn.
We'll say this. We watched that scene right before their wedding where she said, "I've told you from jump, I've never wavered that I wanted a prenup. Why are you feigning confusion now?" He hemmed and hawed, called his lawyer. His lawyer didn't pick up. She calls her lawyer immediately picks up. And in the midst of a conversation, it's revealed that he had misled his counsel to not realize that she was already splitting their assets together with any joint ventures. So on camera, we've seen him get caught being duplicitous with lies of omission to his own counsel. If you can't even tell the truth to your own lawyers, then you can't act like you're a victim if you didn't do your due diligence when I've been doing my due diligence and I've never wavered on my stand.
I told you from jump. I never wavered. I wanted a prenup. He called his lawyer. No answer. She called hers. Answered immediately. Then it came out. He had not fully disclosed joint ventures to his own legal team. And suddenly, a confused groom became something else entirely. Because when you withhold information from your own lawyer, you're not confused. You're strategic. And when that detail surfaced years later, the story shifted. From tension to deception. The image that had been sold publicly, the good man, blindsided by legal pressure, collapsed under its own footage. Because you cannot cry manipulation while being filmed doing the manipulating. Then the document re-entered the room. The very thing he had once sworn didn't matter. The thing that couldn't stop love. Now it was the one thing he wanted destroyed.
Nice to meet you. It's nice to meet you. Hi, Todd. Marjorie's my notary.
Okay.
Reagan is going to be one of the witnesses. Kate will be the other witness.
I decided to sign a prenup against my lawyer's advice. In the end, I know all this legal stuff is not going to keep me from being with Kandi. You do many of these on the day of the wedding?
I have done a couple.
Yeah.
All right, I'm rolling. Okay.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, ready. Okay. This is a video recording of the execution of the prenuptial agreement between Kandi Burruss and Todd Tucker. You acknowledge that you've had a sufficient amount of time and opportunity to fully consider the prenuptial agreement and to request changes to the prenuptial agreement.
Yes.
You understand that you are giving up your rights to periodic alimony, lump sum alimony, alimony in kind, attorney's fees and expenses of litigation, property settlement, equitable distribution, and community.
It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It was recorded. With witnesses. With a notary. With legal language striping away every future excuse. And when that audio resurfaced in court, it didn't just contradict his claims. It erased them. Because now, there was proof. The fantasy was gone. And in its place sat a paper trail. And a consequence. Which is when the last interview hit differently. Not as commentary. As confession.
A question for people who have had prenups or who are part of the prenup land or who have signed a prenup. How easy is it to get out of it? Because the way Todd is running this shit is crazy, bruh. This man said, I want to break that damn prenup when he sat there on live TV and said, I'm going to sign this prenup because ain't nothing going to stop me. Ain't nothing going to stop our love. We're going to be together forever. You signed that shit. And Kandi, you was right. You was smart. But now he wants the...
That wasn't frustration. That was exposure. The moment someone demands children and money after being legally boxed out, you are no longer watching heartbreak. You're watching leverage. And that is where part one ends. Not with a scream. Not with tears. Not even with betrayal. It ends with a realization far darker than divorce. This was never about repair. This was about replacement. Not of love. Of security. And as the courts prepare to hear what the internet already feels, one thing is undeniable. This was not a breakup. This was a breach. Of silence. Of image. And of a plan that finally ran out of time. By the time the paperwork hit the clerk's desk, the image was already dead. It just hadn't been buried yet. Publicly, the story was still being sold as civil. 2 parents. 1 separation. Mutual respect. But privately, the posture had hardened into something colder. Calculated. Strategic. Legal. Because once contracts fail, people stop talking. And start filing. The first shock wasn't that custody had been demanded. It was how. Not as a discussion. Not as a negotiation. Not as a compromise between parents. As a claim. Full custody. Support. Control. A 3-part offensive wrapped inside official language. No letters. No mediation. No soft landing. Just emotion clean, precise, unmistakable. A subpoena disguised as civility. And for the first time since the marriage began unraveling in slow motion, Kandi was no longer reacting. She was preparing. The opposition expected emotion. They were about to meet documentation. Because what looked like a family dispute was actually becoming a financial autopsy. Every business, every investment, every shared asset, every royalty stream was now under legal light. Not gossip light. Forensic light. Where profit paths are traced backwards. Where people stop being spouses and start becoming entries in ledgers. Inside her legal camp, strategy replaced shock. Lines were drawn. Marital property versus individual earnings. Business ownership versus creative origin. Support versus dependency. Custody versus availability. Nothing was emotional anymore. It was structural. And Todd's filing, while aggressive, had a weakness. It assumed the door to that prenup could be reopened. But that door had witnesses. And witnesses don't forget. The story shifted among lawyers first. Then among accountants. Then in whispers through industry rooms where people pretend not to know each other. While knowing everything, contracts were reviewed. Shares were isolated. Dates were cross-referenced. The idea that something could be reclaimed unraveled quickly once legal language entered the building. Because money doesn't care about history. And courts don't care about love. They care about responsibility. And responsibility leaves a trail. The children, of course, became the emotional lever. Not as names. As positions. A claim of primary care here. A schedule there. A calendar used like a battlefield map. And it's here where everything became radioactive. Because custody is never just about access. It's about narrative. Who was present? Who traveled? Who provided? Who missed school events? Who paid tuition? Who signed forms? Parenting turned forensic. Not because either side suddenly loved the kids more, but because someone decided love would have to be proven in timestamps. Suddenly, the idea of availability mattered. Work schedules mattered. Travel mattered. Rehearsals mattered. Contracts mattered. Silence mattered. Every moment off camera became evidence on it. And the public remained unaware, not because nothing was happening. Because everything was. This wasn't loud. It was silent. The most dangerous kind. Because while the audience waited for social media statements, the real verdicts were forming behind conference room glass. And without saying a word, Kandi's camp made a decision. No interviews. No Instagram essays. No emotional confessionals. Because once you speak publicly, you surrender privately. And in a fight this mechanical, silence wasn't weakness. It was ownership. Meanwhile, something else happened quietly. Fans stopped choosing sides based on emotion. They started choosing based on patterns. That clip that once felt joking didn't feel funny anymore. That statement about assets didn't feel harmless. That hypothetical didn't sound accidental. The pieces didn't move. They fell. And people noticed. Not because they were told, but because the tone shifted. This wasn't heartbreak. It was posture. Whispers of resentment turned into conclusions. Jealousy didn't look petty anymore. It looked structural. When the public image of a provider intersects with private insecurity, the result isn't drama. It's pressure. The kind that doesn't burst in public, but corrodes in private. And when pressure meets paperwork, something always breaks. Either a marriage or a lie. What hadn't yet happened was the part no one can control. Judgment. Not from a judge. From a culture that smells intention. And intention is impossible to fake for long. Todd's narrative shifted again. Not softer. Sharper. Because once your position weakens legally, you harden emotionally. Then came the internal fracture. Not leaked. Not reported. Felt. The shift from husband to adversary became permanent. They weren't negotiating a tomorrow. They were defending 2 different pasts. And courts hate disagreements about history. Because they can be documented. The legal teams prepared for war, but war without noise, which is always the deadliest form. Depositions were drafted. Communications were archived. People who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly contacted. Receipts mattered. Silence mattered more. What wasn't said publicly? The marriage wasn't breaking down. It was being dismantled. One clause at a time, one motion per week. And every filing only made one thing clearer. This wasn't about divorce. It was about domination. Over outcome. Over narrative. Over future. And as Thanksgiving passed without peace, and winter set in without forgiveness, inside one courtroom folder sat something devastatingly simple. Dates. Names. Signatures. The enemy of every revisionist story. There is no doubt left about one truth. This isn't a reunion story. This isn't a redemption arc. This is the anatomy of a separation so precise. It doesn't allow emotion to survive it. Because when two people stop loving, that's tragic. But when they stop trusting, that's final. And no amount of memory can change paperwork. By the time the court calendar locked the dates, the story had stopped being about who was hurt and turned into who would withstand it. From the outside, the case looked like a custody dispute mixed with a contract challenge. From the inside, it felt like a controlled demolition of a life built in public. Nothing about it moved fast, but everything about it cut deep. Strategy replaced sentiment. Silence replaced statements. The era of explaining had ended. The era of proving had arrived. What few people understood was that the custody fight was never a single demand. It was a chain reaction. Once one line in a filing questioned the past, every year before it became evidence. Parenting wasn't argued with love anymore. It was audited. Dates replaced memories. Schedules replaced stories. Hotels and studios became witness boxes. Travel logs grew louder than lullabies. And in quiet conference rooms, strangers began deciding what present really meant. Presence was no longer a feeling. It was a timestamp. The prenup challenge was not about fairness, no matter how often that word was used. It was about rewinding time, undoing paperwork, re-editing a marriage after the fact. Courts don't like time machines. And judges don't respond well to regret disguised as unfairness. The document didn't speak in emotion. It spoke in yes and no. It spoke in understanding and waiver. It spoke in finality. So the argument had to become something else. Pressure. Confusion. Rushed decisions. Anything that would let a courtroom believe a microphone had captured something wrong instead of something clean. But recordings aren't poetic. They're clinical. And clinical things don't bend for sympathy. While the legal teams traded motions, the public chased meaning the way people always do when a story goes quiet. They searched past footage with new eyes. Every compliment sounded conditional. Every disagreement felt rehearsed. The earlier jokes stopped landing. The hypothetical conversations began to look prophetic. Even jokes about money felt like confessions. Because once the mask slips, even slightly, nothing beneath it looks accidental anymore. The problem with power couples is that the public never sees the power break. They see the smiles fade, the posts slow, the absences grow. But they don't feel the shift the moment boardrooms replace bedrooms. They don't hear the name of a business spoken with bitterness for the first time. They don't see a future recalculated in silence. But something in this case betrayed itself. Not through leaks. Through tone. Through the sudden weight behind words that once floated. Custody became the emotional epicenter. Not because it should have been, but because it could be. Children always change the temperature of a case. The moment a filing mentions them, the oxygen shifts. Every argument suddenly claims to be love. Every demand claims to be protection. But courts are not fooled by language. They are persuaded by pattern. Who is there each morning? Who signs at night? Who shows up when nothing is being filmed? The paperwork didn't care about fame. It cared about frequency. And the frequency told its own story. Outside the courtroom, the audience split into two camps the way audiences always do. Some believed legacy erased liability. Others believed documentation erased myth. The louder each side became, the quieter the actual proceedings went. Because real power never performs when it's working. It edits. What shook even seasoned observers wasn't the hostility. It was the discipline. This was not chaos. This was control. Not outbursts, but placements. Not breakdowns, but chronology. Not screaming, but sequencing. The legal teams moved like archivists, unpacking a relationship down to the year and inch. Each filing felt less like an argument and more like a catalog of what once worked and what finally didn't. And somewhere in all of it, a revelation settled in like fog. This was never about winning the future alone. It was about rewriting the past. Rewriting a past is harder than building one. It requires every memory to be discounted, every signature to be suspect, every moment alone to be reframed. And once that machine starts, it doesn't stop with contracts. It reaches for character. It makes kindness look transactional. It turns patience into passivity. It repaints support as obligation. It retrofits love into leverage. That was the moment the story turned irreversible. Because when a case reaches for your history instead of your outcome, it is no longer a disagreement. It is an excavation. And excavations don't heal. They reveal. The legal briefings grew denser, the language colder, the tone sharper, and quietly, dangerously, the emotional vocabulary vanished. Words like marriage and family began to disappear under terms like interest, equity, standing, and consideration. People aren't erased by paperwork, but their roles are. Public interest spiked, not because of new quotes, but because of old ones now understood differently. People returned to moments they once brushed past, noticing how quickly money entered the room, how often future hypotheticals appeared in present conversations, how frequently devotion was measured in provision. And nowhere was the fracture more visible than in how the world began to talk about power. Not celebrity power. Domestic power. Who lives where? Who controls what? Who has final say when cameras leave? Who moves when the contract ends? Who stays when the lights go off? These weren't Hollywood questions. These were human ones. Ancient ones. And they returned in this case with modern weapons. No one waited for verdicts anymore. They waited for tone. For posture. For the invisible shift that happens before paper becomes permanent. And it came, not with an explosion, with an alignment. The filings began to read as if they shared a spine. Consistent. Directed. Focused on one idea. Undo the boundary. The boundary was not the marriage. It was the prenup. And a breached boundary is always louder than a broken heart. By now, everyone involved understood that the end would not feel cinematic. There would be no emotional crescendo. No final glare through courtroom doors. No audio of someone collapsing. It would be anticlimactic. Administrative. A stamp. A signature. A judgment attached quietly to a file name. And yet the impact would last forever. Because the first thing a legal decision changes is not money. It is memory. Years from now, people won't remember the smiles. They'll remember the dispute. They won't quote the vows. They'll quote the filings. They won't replay the wedding. They'll replay the courtroom. A life that was once filmed for entertainment would now be archived for evidence. And that is the quietest tragedy of all. When love is reduced to litigation. When romance becomes record-keeping. When a family becomes a case study. And when two people who once promised permanence end up pleading temporality. As this chapter closes, no one knows what the judge will decide. No one knows what shape the family will take when the ink finally dries. But one thing is no longer debated. Everything that could be preserved has already been documented. Everything that could be hidden has already been brought into light. And whatever story remains after the verdict will not be written by either of them. It will be written by record. That is where this ends. Not with a kiss. Not with a collapse. Not with forgiveness. With a file. Closed. The internet will move on. It always does. Another story. Another scandal. Another couple pulled apart in public while strangers argue from couches and comment sections. But this one will not disappear the way the others do. Because this wasn't just a breakup. It was a warning. About what happens when contracts replace conversations. When love turns into leverage. When children become strategy. And when silence becomes more dangerous than noise. What you've just seen is not entertainment. It's anatomy. A marriage taken apart piece by piece with legal tools instead of emotional ones. A reminder that not every collapse sounds like yelling. Some sound like paperwork sliding across a table. Some sound like signatures. Some sound like a life being reorganized without asking permission. History will not remember who posted first. It will remember who prepared longest. This story is not being written on social media. It's being written in documentation. And once documentation speaks, nobody's image survives it clean. If you think this ends with a judgment, you haven't been paying attention. Court rulings close cases. They don't close wounds. What happens after the verdict is where the real damage lives. In routines that don't line up. In schedules that don't overlap. In children who will one day Google their own childhoods. You're not watching gossip. You're watching a timeline fracture in real time. And the quiet part? This is not the final chapter. This is the part right before consequences become permanent. If you want to understand what happens next, you won't find it in headlines. You'll find it in what doesn't get said. In what doesn't get shown. In the silence that follows after everyone thinks it's over. Stay alert. Stay curious. Because stories like this don't end when the cameras turn off. That's when they finally start telling the truth.